Thank you all for coming, I appreciate it. How many here are familiar with the book, the Bat-Manga book? Okay, and how many of you have taken in the show? Okay, so it's about half and half, because I don't want to bore you to death with stuff you already know. The book, as Ellen said, the book did come out in 2008. I'm just going to give a sort of history of the book and how it came about, and then sort of what happened after the book came out. A couple of interesting things. As you may or may not know, I'm something of a professional Batman fan, if such a thing can be said. And in 1996, I did a book called Batman Collected, and that was a sort of coffee table book on Batman toys, and it was my first attempt to do a book on Batman on my own. I mean, I had a lot of help, and the photographer thereof, a gentleman named Jeff Spear, is with us tonight in the back, and he's also the photographer on Bat-Manga. Both of which were shot just blocks from here. His studio is just a couple blocks over near Canal Street. And there's a section in that book on vintage Japanese Batman toys from the 60s. Now, at that point, that's all that I thought existed. And then a friend of mine, a cartoonist named David Mazzucchelli, who had a show in this museum, had come back from a trip to Japan, and he said, did you know, or did you ever hear about vintage Japanese Batman comics that were by and for the Japanese artists, Japanese readers, and original? And I said, no, I had not known about that. And then I made this kind of one of my many sort of holy grail things to pursue. And then eBay came out. And I started to see evidence of people putting Japanese Batman stuff on eBay. And I was bidding on a Batman tin Batmobile. And those were the early days of eBay, when anybody could sort of write to anybody else. And somebody called I Collect Batman emailed me on eBay and said, you really shouldn't bid on that, because the owner is bluffing. It's a tainted toy. It's not completely original. And so I de-bid on it and wrote back to this I Collect Batman person, who turned out to be a guy named Saul Ferris in Chicago, and we became collector pals, because he also has a deep interest in vintage Japanese Batman stuff. And so, long story short, we started to talk about trying to find these comics. I know enough people at DC and in their archive to know that DC had none of this in their archive, and to this day they don't have any of it in their archive, which is a little unusual, because they're super strict about archiving everything else. But this they did not. And basically, so what you see here is the cover of a kids' comics anthology that came out every week called Shonen King. And this was all brought about by, as you can see, the Adam West TV show, which came out in 1966, went global, and became this sort of huge instant big hit in Japan, as well as everywhere else. But they were the only country who contacted DC about licensing the rights to create, write, and produce their own original Batman and Robin stories for their audience. And it was initially born out of the Adam West look, but the comics inside were drawn by a gentleman named Jiro Kawada. Now, he was not the artist on this piece, but this was sort of totally irresistible to us, so we made it the cover. Again, you know, what exactly is going on here? And Robin has a gun, and it seemed to be sort of smuggled away by Batman for God knows what purpose. So, so we put what we call an obi, or a belly band, which is a very Japanese device on books, usually for advertising, but in our case we incorporated it into the design, so that it, the design itself is sort of like complicated and simplified at the same time. And we did a simultaneous soft and hardcover, so that was the paperback, and then this was the hardcover. Now this is Jiro Kawada's drawing, and the funny thing was, I was already aware of Jiro Kawada, but I didn't realize it. I grew up in Reading, Pennsylvania. We got all the Philadelphia TV stations, and Channel 17 out of Philadelphia imported kids' Japanese shows for after school. So we would see Ultraman and Johnny Sacco and all of this stuff. Well, one of the cartoons, and Astro Boy, a major, but one of the cartoons was Eighth Man, which I really, really loved. And Eighth Man was basically the people that made RoboCop completely ripped off the Eighth Man concept to make RoboCop. It's the exact same story. But Eighth Man was also a manga. And getting ahead of myself, basically, long story short, we found out that Jiro Kawada was still alive, as he is to this day, and living as something of a recluse about 2 or 3 hours north of Tokyo. And I had some Japanese contacts who were willing to go up and approach him on my behalf and interview him and make it known that we wanted to do this book. And so this was a really cool, amazing thing. So here he is holding our book proposal, and he doesn't communicate by email, barely communicates by phone, but through this party, he got back to me and said, oh, I had no idea there was such interest in Japanese Batman in America. And I communicated back to him, that's because there isn't. Nobody really knows about this, but I would like to try and change that by publishing this book. And the thing with these stories were they sort of came and went very quickly, within a year, although an enormous output was created in that time. If you look at the Bat-Manga book, it represents about half of what was done, and it's thick. So basically, these stories were serialized every week in Shonen King, and the kids would read them, and then they'd go on to the next one, and it was like, it was a serialization, and they were not very archival manga books, and not well printed, but it was a fad, just like it was a fad here, and so they came out and were very popular, and then within a year, just not anymore, and they stopped it. And that was it. This was 1966 to 1967. They never collected any of this work, let alone translated it or exported it. So basically, we would, Saul and I would get a couple of these issues through rare Japanese manga dealers and Japanese eBay, which is interesting to try and negotiate. So we got a couple issues of it, and marveling at each one, to the point where we thought, okay, we think we have enough for a smallish book, but let's see how much more we can get. But once we had that proposal that you saw him holding there, I went into then president of DC Comics, Paul Levitz, and I had a meeting with him, and I showed him the proposal, and he looked at it, and he said, this is amazing, and I've never seen any of this before. And he said, we need to make sure we still have the legal right to publish it, and if we do, you can do your book. But he said, you know, we can, you know, that's as much as we're going to be able to do for you. Like we can't help you find this stuff. That's going to be up to you. So it became, you know, this sort of this treasure hunt.